Money has always been a topic that women are supposedly not talk about. Women are very often not the one that actually take control and have access to a lot of financial services. Another entry point for me to understand financial inclusion was also in Europe. Generally, financial inclusion has been seen as quite a lot of what Western and Middle European country has achieved very high level of financial inclusion or almost full. But as I mentioned before, I used to work a lot with migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. But I know with my own eyes that is not the case for them.
In this episode, we're in conversation with XiaoXiao. You might know her as Xiaoji Song. She's an artist, writer, and researcher currently residing in Berlin, Germany.
In her practice, she focuses on community-centric experiences with mediums that range from poetry and text and game design to theater and live performance.
XiaoXiao shares what inspired her to follow a creative pathway, her art becoming a tool of political expression, which led her to focus on themes close to her heart, such as migration and financial exclusion. Welcome.
Thank you.
Xiaoji, thank you so much for joining us on the Future Money podcast. I'd love to hear more about your origin story, like where you're from originally, what first inspired you to a path of artistry. As you've been saying, the themes that guide your work are migration, techno-politics. These are meaty theoretical topics that you've chosen to pursue through the medium of art. So I'm curious, how you arrived to understanding that intersection of geopolitical phenomena within your artistic practice.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it's actually super relevant also for the work that I am currently working on, commissioned by Interledger Foundation. I grew up in Wuhan, China. It's now, let's say, famous city globally. But I also want to talk about it's not just famous for the reason that everyone knows, but it's also the punk city of China. I grew up with hearing revolutionary stories in my history. I grew up at, let's say, a societal fabric that is quite different than right now, with civil society is still quite active and alive. And I was always interested in using art as a tool for political expression, as a tool for movement building. And it was sort of also the only way for people like me to kind of participate in politics and to express my political views and to also start dialogues with people of marginalized communities and with people of different groups and different communities. I came from a family of migration. That's also why that migration has been such a central topic of my work, my artistic practices as well. My grandma was born and grew up in Indonesia. She went to China when she was 14, 15, when she was just a teenager by boat with her other sisters and brothers, and many of them. It was a different time. It was a different time where we imagine and we see border differently, when the institutions were different, when migration was seen as differently, and the Chinese diaspora at that generation, they went to China to build a new country. And then Cultural Revolution happened. So that's another story. So I think for me, that is in some way, there were this talk about intergenerational trauma, but I've recently learned this term intergenerational knowledge system is by comparing my grandma's migration experiences and my own experiences of shifting identity from an international student to a migrant, and also by just being in Germany, a democratic society, when it was 2015 and 2016, when there was also a lot of changes in migration in society. This informed my points of view and informed my understanding about migration integration as a topic. And that makes it such a relevant and important topic for me, both personally and when it comes to what kind of society that I want to live in. Techno-politics, also growing up in accelerating Chinese society where techno-solutionism is sort of the only way to go when we grow up. I was deeply influenced by feminist science and technology studies during my undergrads that also is one of the major topics that I'm exploring because of, let's say, it's also quite a personal reason.
So I'm actually quite curious, especially when you mentioned the punk background of Wuhan. How did that influence, in combination with the techno-politics, your own artistic practice?
That's really like exactly what I like to talk about. So I grew up in a street that basically is considered, I don't know how's that called in English, but we call it like back street of a school or like a university. So it's like the street that is very close to a university campus where all the students hang out, have drinks, and like do different, like, organize small readings, organize community events. And I grew up in the back street of the local art school. And that's where I went to elementary school, middle school, high school. And that is also the street of the start of the graffiti culture in my hometown. It's also the street with like the punk scene is not all there, but they were like small, in Chinese actually in East Asia we call it live houses. It's like kind of like a music revenue for small like independent concert to happen. In that street when I grow up, I see a lot of like urban contestation. There were a lot of people trying to do graffiti, art school students trying to organize screening, films, and music. This is like a sense of rebellion, the sense of like self-organization, direct actions, and like taking care of each other in the community. It's also the street that not only with all different subcultures, but also one of, let's say, the most poor area of the old Wuhan. I think it reminds me a lot of like Schiller Kids in Berlin.
Oh, yeah.
And that waves and waves of actions I can see when I grow up strongly influence my opinions about how art is inherently political, what kind of effect art can have on people, and not just in a gallery. I don't grow up with galleries. Galleries is like a new thing for me. But I grow up with street art, and I grow up with small music revenue. I grow up with different tiny readings and screenings and people campaigning in the street. So I think that spirit is still inside me. And that's also one of the reasons I didn't choose to go to an art school, but instead I was learning about social sciences. I was learning about politics during my time of studying. I mean, of course, right now my idea about art has changed a lot, and my idea about like if art school is something like I should consider change a lot. But originally, that's where I come from. For me, art is for building infrastructure of imagination. Is when I grow up, if it's not because of seeing those subculture things, seeing those street art, I would not be here. I would not ever think about going abroad and like coming to Germany and leaving Europe and maybe like go somewhere else in the future even.
That's so great. Thank you so much for sharing that. I just love that phrase, building infrastructure of imagination. I think that like absolutely perfectly encapsulates really what the future money ethos is and why Interledger is so interested in this charge of like, how do we create and be creative around creating possibility? And just as you've said, how you personally in your life path was transformed by encountering and being steeped in a city of art that was inherently political and wasn't gallerized and wasn't kind of separated and cut off from like the politics of everyday life. Could you tell us more about like your actual arts practice and medium? I know we'll get eventually into the project that you're developing with the Future Money artist cohort, but I'm curious about like your own personal path in terms of your practice and medium.
When I first came to Europe, like I would say like my first real art project is just like a theater project. That happened when I was really young, when I just came to Germany, when it was like 2015, 2016. I started working with community theater and documentary theater. And it was largely because I was doing a lot of volunteering works with the local organization that were helping the refugees incoming. And I was also always passionate about small theater and film and cinema. Like that was also influenced by my upbringing in my hometown. So for a long time, I was working with storytelling through theater and through film. So I was also doing some moving images work. And over the years, I started to experiment with different mediums. So now I'm working with text a lot. I work with audio. I work with moving image still. I still work with performances, but not strictly theater performances anymore. I'm very interested in lecture performances. And also right now I work with game as a medium. And that is also like the project that I'm doing with Interledger.
Do you have a preference?
I've been thinking about that for a long time. I think at the moment, I am most interested in text as a medium of art.
Mhm.
And I think that's probably not necessarily my preference because of what I enjoy to create with the most. It's probably because that text is not usually seen as a serious art form.
Absolutely. How do you then apply the text? Because there are different types of things. You can also apply it in that sense, kind of like in where it's more design based. So the focus is more about the aesthetics.
I think I'm very interested in playing with first narratives itself, and I think that's like quite a common approach when it comes to working with text. But I'm also very interested in like using different genre of writing, some genre of writing that are very often seen as an institutional symbol, for example, to play with those formats about like what kind of clashes different genres of writing can do to each other. So that's something that I also use with lecture performances and in other performances I'm doing.
Very cool. So maybe we can walk our way up into like from that origin of theater and documentary theater and then diving into text. Like, how did you encounter and begin to explore games and the creation and design of games as your art practice? And what have you discovered through exploring it?
This sort of like anarchist spirit and like anarchist thought behind my artistic practice was something that also brings me to the game. So studying like a lot about politics, I am not very interested in the, let's say in German, Realpolitik, like I like English, maybe real politics as an approach to discuss politics and to describe, let's say, how we make political action. I am very interested in prefigurative politics. Like as an academic concept, it's very closely like associated with anarchism as an alternative framework to examine like how political change can happen and to as a way to describe not just for the discourse focusing on alternative on what is understood as a consequentialist way of analyzing political action. I'm interested in prefiguration as a micro-transformative structure to kind of anticipate on what kind of future we want to imagine for ourselves.
The thing is that sometimes we choose mediums and they have a certain type of attachments.
I think I find it very often hard to describe what games means for me because I don't grow up playing games. When I was a teenager, when we had our first computer, my dad was always playing, this game called Red Alert. You know, those super aggressive strategy war game.
I used to play them as well.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
But I suck at them. So I don't grow up playing this game. When I was a kid, when I tried to find a game for me in the computer, I played with Microsoft PowerPoint. I thought that's the most fun thing in the world and front page. So for a long time, game is not something for me. I don't associate with being a gamer. I don't grow up playing a lot of games. I only started to discover game a few years ago because of my other project, Alien Without Extraordinary Ability. And because of that project, I was thinking hard and long about what medium I should choose. And like a good friend was talking with me for a long time about what do I actually need to do with this. And I start to realize like I want to give a possibility for radical imagination through this project. I did some writing, I did some design work, and I did a bunch of stuff that I have no idea how to combine them together. And at a certain point, I realized that what I need is a game. And I started to design games. And I realized how much agency I feel in that process. Also, how much agency that people feel when they are getting engaged with the project itself, because you're not just an audience, you're not just a reader, you're not just a viewer. You actually get to interact with it. There are other format that you also get to interact with, but what's special about game for me is the possibility of world building, the possibility of blending reality and fiction. And I started to also play like indie games that are not like crazy strategy war games. I wouldn't say I have a personal attachment to games. It just feels like this is a medium that I can connect so many things together and to have the necessary function for me to have a sort of like critical engagement with certain topics. I hope that answers the question.
It answers the question. I completely understand, also because of the agency that games create. Because with games you create rules that people have to follow, or the audience has to follow.
I'd love to transition into talking about the project that you are working on, the Parallel Society, specifically as commissioned by Interledger for the Future Money Artist Grant. Would love to hear about how your concept of this developed, and anything you'd like to share, because I know that this isn't your first connection point with Interledger Foundation. So we'd kind of love to hear how you arrived at the concept of this project.
I think like financial inclusion as a topic for me has always been quite relevant. I think especially as a women. Women are very often disproportionately impacted by financial exclusion. And even though I grew up in a quite like urban citizenship household in China, where we have a sort of like a socialist feminist infrastructure, where the double income family in China were quite high compared to many other countries in the world. Money has always been a topic that women are supposedly not talk about. Women are very often not the one that actually like take control and have access to a lot of financial services. Another entry point for me to understand financial inclusion was also in Europe. Generally, financial inclusion has been seen as like a lot of like what Western and Middle European country has achieved very high level of financial inclusion or almost full. But as I mentioned before, I used to work a lot with migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. But I know with my own eyes that is not the case for them. I know in my own eyes that many of them are quite excluded from the system. There were very limited access for them. And even for the Chinese immigrants community of second or third generations in Europe, many of them still has a fear of the financial systems here. And their fear of financial system exclude them from getting access to it. And a lot of their needs were not met, such as currency exchange and also handling taxes. I've seen the consequences of this sort of financial exclusion. And this is what brings me sort of to this topic and brings me also to my project, the Parallel Society project. Parallel Society project as a project is a storytelling game that kind of explores the financial inclusion as a topic by featuring the fate of the two characters. And what I was interested in this project was the two characters, one as a migrant and one as a rural villager. So usually in political discourses, migrants and local working class people, marginalized local populations are very often pitted against each other. I use the concept of parallel society is also a bit of a play in the world, because parallel society in the German context is, maybe in the whole European context, is a term that is used to usually describe like self-organization of like ethnic or religious minorities. And after it was coined, there were a lot of like policy based on it, but there's also a lot of controversies around it. I am also not a very big fan of this term because of it puts emphasis on the minorities themselves to bear the responsibility of integrating into a society where there aren't enough integration infrastructure. So there were a lot of like discussion, like academic critiques of it, that is used to describe this group of communities that were being cut off from very often access from the so-called mainstream culture. And in those kind of discourse, integration and assimilation are usually used interchangeably, even though they mean completely different things. So this is a bit of my play with the word. Related to this, what I want to highlight is not a parallel society between the so-called mainstream society and this minority migrant racialized population society, but the parallel society between the migrants who are often cut off from access and the local marginalized working class population, rural population, who also often echoes the same struggles as different form of marginalization, and how their parallel fates echo with each other, but are very often not seen as a parallel struggle, but they actually are parallel struggles.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all of that. There's just so many fantastic lines of thinking that were really provocative. And I think just to call out my appreciation for recognizing that, yeah, that when we talk about financial inclusion, we have to look beyond this kind of self-congratulatory Western accomplishment, and just by this concept of just by naming the concept of financial inclusion that the work is done. I just kind of love that call out. But I think that what I hear for you too is like you're problematizing this kind of binary between like the migrant versus the local, or the fallacy of that there's those who are kind of like native or of the nationality and those that are apart, and recognizing that there actually is so much commonality, whether it's between class or between economic experience. And yeah, I'm curious, like to that end, specifically would love to hear what you've uncovered or learned through developing this game of the parallel society as part of the Future Money cohort.
I think like the first thing is that I am digging deep into, let's say, different forms of struggles that are for both groups of people. Maybe just for a little bit of context, that I came up with this idea also because of, let's say, two actual news events. And one is the collapse of a rural bank in Henan in 2022 in China, and the series of protests that comes with it because of the collapse of a rural bank. And the second news is in Spain, in Barcelona. There was a news about two Chinese immigrants scam millions of euro from a group of other Chinese immigrants who does not have much access to the financial systems, and they promised to help them with visa residency status, and they also promised to help them with currency exchange, in also managing their funds related to their businesses that are, many of them do not really trust the Spanish banks and have faced like long-term discrimination and marginalization in the society there. There aren't enough focuses put on, let's say, people who on paper they have the access, but why don't they use it? Why don't they actually go into that bank? Why don't they actually get in touch with those services? These are the topics and like the struggles that I'm interested in highlighting in my work. Financial exclusion as their lived experiences, how does that influence their way of understanding and thinking about finance? And how does that influence their behavior patterns? And how these experiences, if documented and understood, can be used to create better tools to help them. So I was doing some research both on like digging into literature related to it, such as like how different migratory phases for a migrant, how does that correspond to different financial needs? What are for majority of people the most important needs? And also about lived experiences of like their fears, their struggles, their experiences of discrimination, and their trauma and their habits. These are the things that I have been learning throughout the experiences of doing this project. I'm also very interested in the very like emotional embodied aspects of those topics. And like another thing that I've been learning throughout the process of my work with the Future Money Artist cohort is that I felt like it was so interesting to see other artists and other practitioners, their perspectives and their topics and their projects. Because what I am working on is, I would say, a very like micro-sociological perspective. And many of them are taking a different level of analysis, different level of like extracting different sort of like materials, different experiences, and different imaginations, and how our imaginaries of different levels in some way connect and interlink with each other. And that's something I've been learning a lot throughout the process as well.
I also believe it's very important to have kind of like these different levels or these different lenses on these projects. And that's also, we on purposely within the selection process kind of like looked at the diversity of the cohort as well. So everyone's focus is very different.
I can see that.
Yeah.
And that's been really enriching for me.
I do have another question for you. And it's kind of like, it's about the current game parallel societies, of course. We're very curious when it will be finalized. But what do you hope people will take away from it?
I think what I wish for people to take away on it is, I would say first is to sort of having this understanding about this divide and dichotomy between migrant and local dichotomy. Like, I want people to have this understanding of the arbitrariness of this dichotomy, I would say. And I'm also very interested in having, maybe not necessarily, this is not a takeaway that I wish people to have, but like a dialogue that I wish to have with and around the topics of financial inclusion beyond the very institutional skills, the emotional aspects and the psychological aspects and the microsociological aspects of like how being financially excluded can influence your way of thinking, your way of interacting with yourself, with people around you, and with the society, and how the sense of scarcity, how the sense of exclusion creates embodiment in our body that cannot be very easily taken away just because one thing has changed or one policy has changed. I think that would be the takeaway that I wish people would have after they see my work.
I completely agree. I also believe that's something within the entire conversation of financial inclusion that should be highlighted more, because it's forgotten.
Yes, absolutely.
When do you think you'll be ready? Because I really want to play the game.
I think it's next spring sometime.
Cool.
Within the current plan. So next spring.
Well, we're really excited to see your work come to life. And I think as we wind down this conversation, we're just really grateful for not only your presence and willingness to talk to us, but just the depth and the consideration and the personal sense of purpose that you have throughout your work. I know I'm leaving this conversation feeling really invigorated, and I think I really am interested in the way that you chose the medium of gaming, and just to know that like, oh, gaming isn't necessarily something that like I had in my childhood, but just how we can use more like irreverent mediums to talk about weighty political and economic issues, and excited to see it all come to light.
Thank you so much, Xiaoji. Thank you for being part of the Future Money podcast. And I'm really looking forward to seeing your finalized project.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm looking forward to finalizing the game and being able to share with the rest of the world. Talk to you soon.
To learn more about the Interledger Foundation, visit our website where you can find all of the published episodes
and more information on our guests, grant programs, and our resources at interledger.org.
Thank you for listening.